Welcome to another episode of Teacher Talks with Michael Klotz, a series of conversations with some of my favorite string players about their beloved teachers. Today I am joined by Andrés Cárdenes, violinist and conductor, in a conversation about his teacher, Josef Gingold. Good morning, Andrés. Thanks so much for being here.
Great to see you, Mike.
Great to see you as always. And of course, this is the next best thing to actually sitting down and playing music together.
It's a shame that we haven't been able to do that for a while.
But it'll mean that much more once we can.
I agree.
Well, listen, so thanks so much for being a part of Teacher Talks. And I would love to speak with you about Mr. Gingold today.
My favorite subject.
I think so. And could we start by you telling us how did you meet Mr. Gingold? Please share that with our listeners.
Well, I met him under very unusual circumstances. Actually, I was about 16 years old, and I went to the Denver Young Artist Competition, and I arrived thinking I was pretty good, and thought I probably had a good chance of winning that competition. But when I arrived, there were particularly two people who had their very glossy flyer photos, and it said Columbia Artist Presents and Young Concert Artist Presents. And the minute I got there, I knew I wasn't going to win because these kids were much older than me and already had managers. And I was 16 years old. So I kind of knew my fate before I even wound up playing. But after I played okay. But of course, I didn't make the finals. And I was feeling rather dejected. And I walked out of the building and I bumped into Mr. Gingold, who was on the jury. And I just said hello. Of course, I knew who he was, but I just said hello. And he saw that I had kind of a hangdog look on me. And he said, don't be too dejected or anything. Don't worry. You're a wonderful violinist. You have a lot of talent. You're obviously very gifted in so many things. I'd like for you to come and study with me. So don't feel bad. And of course, I immediately went from the abyss to seventh heaven. And from that moment on, I knew that that's what I really wanted to study with.
Yeah. And of course, you studied with him at Indiana University.
Right. I was with him for 5 years.
For 5 years. Okay. And previous to that, did you play for him at all before you formally started studying with him? Would you go and meet with him?
I was very worried because Mr. Gingold was so popular. He was so famous as a teacher that even though he told me at that competition in Denver that he wanted me to study with him, I felt like if I wasn't constantly reminding him that I existed, that I was afraid he might forget about me. So the following year, I was 17. I contacted him and asked him if I could come play for him. And I came and I played for him. And he remembered me, fortunately. And then I went again and played for him the following year. So I played for him twice before I went to college to be absolutely sure that he would remember me and that he would take me. And so I had quite a bit of contact with him before I ever actually officially studied with him.
Wow. And, I know, of course, from stories from you and some of my other colleagues that Mr. Gingold was just such a warm personality that, of course, he had musically had such very high standards, but he was just warm and supportive. Can you talk about his humanity?
That was the thing that was probably the most striking thing about him when he didn't have the violin under his chin, and he talked and he shared stories about his life, and he was the most cultured, the most knowledgeable person I think I ever met. Mike, many times during my lessons, for instance, we would, of course, be working on something, and he would just stop and just say, wait a minute. The Debussy Sonata. Have you ever seen Water Lilies by Monet? And he would pull out an art book from this big bookcase that he had. He'd pull it out and we'd go over these photographs of these artworks of Monet and Matisse, and And he would explain to me in great detail what the Impressionist period was about, and what kind of technique they used in the painting, the pointillistic approach, and then he would always compare it. Another time I was playing Devil's Trill Sonata, and he stopped me because I wasn't really feeling the Sicilian rhythm in the beginning, and he went and he pulled a book from his top shelf. I'll never forget. He pulled it, and he almost went directly to the page that he was looking for, which meant that I kind of suspected he probably had it memorized. And he started reciting a sonnet from Hamlet. And he said, listen to the way I recite this. You'll understand more how to play this. I just, I was an 18-year-old kid. I didn't know Hamlet from from Harry Potter. And so then I played. He goes, yeah, that's right. That's better. That's the right lilt. And I can't tell you how many times, he would bring up a book, or he would stop and say, oh, that chord there in the piano, it's exactly the same chord as Schubert A minor string quartet. And he'd go and he'd play it, and he'd say, this is the voicing of that chord. So, of course, what he was playing, it was immensely, immensely passionate, beautiful, overwhelmingly, emotional to hear him play. He was just such an incredibly profound artist. And that even when he wasn't playing for you, he was always sharing his knowledge about everything: politics, the Soviet Union, Russia, his early years, the Germans when they invaded, during his youthful times when he was very young. He would talk at great length about politics in Europe, the two world wars, coming to America, playing for Toscanini, playing for George Zell. Every lesson was not just play your piece. It was a history lesson. It was a psychology lesson. There was nothing that was left unturned in terms of the overall scope of what he taught.
That's amazing. And those are lessons that you never forget. And right, and it's and you can, and certainly I'm sure that I know that you apply some of that in your own teaching.
It's funny how you say that something I don't forget. It's impossible to forget it, because to me at least, it's like in my DNA now. All the things that he said and did were so profoundly inspiring and so incredibly life altering all the time, that it wasn't just like you remember or you recall or you have a fond feeling about what he taught you one day, but rather he always taught and told you things in a way that went way beyond the retention. It was more like life altering all the time. I think that's what the difference was, is that it's like, you can remember a fingering, or you can remember a piece, or you can actually play it and it comes out like at a cellular level. And I think that's what Mr. Gingold was able to instill in me, and certainly in many other students, is this feeling that whatever he told you and however he said it, it made such a lasting, deep impression on you that you absorbed it differently than information. Information, you absorb it and you process it and you apply it, right? But his information wasn't that simple. It was something you had to think about. You had to go home and dwell on it, meditate on it, really think, really like spend a couple of weeks totally absorbing what he said and trying to put it into practice, not just for the piece, but for everything you did.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the profound impact he had on me.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think that to find somebody with that breadth of knowledge over so many subjects and philosophies, that's rare. That's rare, and I think that there really only been a few pedagogues in history that truly have that all-encompassing ability to teach and to make the students think on many different levels.
That generation of teachers, it isn't just that they shared information; they actually lived much of that. They actually lived it. When we talk about what went on in the Soviet Union from 1917 until the Berlin Wall came down, we weren't privy to that information so much because it was a very private and very enclosed and ensconced country and system, that we knew very little about even their artistic endeavors, right? We occasionally got David Oistrakh got a visa to come over and play for a little while, or Rostropovich would come over for a couple of months and play. But outside of that, it was very difficult to know intimately what was going on over there. And Mr. Gingold and Mr. Shumsky and certainly Mr. Zeitlin, Mr. Bronstein, so many of these old-time teachers, these last links to the golden age of playing, these people lived what they talked about. It wasn't just a history lesson. That's why I say it kind of enters you at a different level, because it's not just sharing information, it's sharing what their lives were like. And for one really very a painful memory is Mr. Gingold telling me the story about when he was about 5 years old, and the Germans had come and invaded his town, Brest-Litovsk, which was then in Russia. It's now been annexed back and forth between Poland and Russia for a number of years after World War II. But the Germans came in and invaded the area, and they were put in a camp, in a war camp. It wasn't a concentration camp, but it was a war camp, meaning that they took the villagers, and most of them were Jewish, and put them aside and kept them in these barracks. And that, they were hungry. They didn't have anything. And the Germans were living in the barracks just down the road. And they came over and talked to the family and said that the soldiers are bored. We hear this little boy here can play the violin. Can he come over and entertain us? So they were scared to death, of course, to let him go by himself. The soldier took him down to the barracks. Mr. Gingold took out his little violin, and his brother had been teaching him a little bit, and he played the mazurka, or the Obertas by Wieniawski, for these German soldiers. And they went crazy. They thought it was great. They had a little entertainment, this little boy, and it was cute. And then they started passing a hat around with money. This is the emotional part. They passed around a hat with money, which, well, they couldn't buy anything with money. There was nothing to buy. Money didn't mean anything. So Mr. Gingold pointed to his stomach, because he couldn't speak German, of course. He pointed to his stomach. And then the officers realized he was hungry. So they put a sack together. They put sausages and, all kinds of meats and cheese and bread, and they gave him the sack. He took that back. And he was like a little hero, in the camp, because he brought all this food that they hadn't seen for months. And curiously, much later, when I was studying with Mr. Gingold, he always had several cans of sardines in his cupboard, and he'd always offer them to me. And I thought that was kind of odd, like sardines, who eats sardines? But Mr. Gingold told me that he had a passion for sardines since that day. Wow. Because they had some cans of sardines in that bag, and he ate them for the first time. And he said, sardines isn't just that he likes them, it's just that there's an emotional attachment, a profound influence on him. Those cans of sardines were like his lifeblood at the time. It's like life-saving. Yeah. So when they talk about those times and they talk about what they went through, like I said, it's not just a history lesson. They lived it. And
that's just an amazing story. And I think that, of course, one can't imagine going through that kind of experience, but certainly from what I know of Mr. Gingold, those kinds of experiences made him appreciate even more, the love and the beauty associated with violin and music. And every interview I've seen of him and heard him speaking, there's just such a kindness to everything that he says. There just didn't seem to be a mean bone in his body.
Well, Mike, you're hitting on something very profound. And that is that Mr. Gingold, I know so much about his background and what happened to him in his life. After that war camp story, the Russians came and liberated the camp, but they could not return to Brest-Litovsk because the Germans were still around and were still determined to keep their presence there. So the villagers were very worried about going back. So they didn't. They lived in the woods, in the forest for a year and a half. And Mr. Gingold and his family started to go back later. They moved around to different cities in the area to try to avoid the Germans as much as they could. But, you know, again, living in the open, Mr. Gingold told me how his mother would go and try to find mushrooms, you know, pick wild mushrooms in the forest and come and cook them on an open flame so that he could have a hot meal. So what's profound about it is that there was never, in all the years I knew Mr. Gingold, I never heard a bitter word out of him. I never saw him like act as if he had been wronged. He never once complained about anything that happened to him in his life. And there was plenty. There are plenty of things that happened to him.
Sure.
Never, ever said anything about it. And so the example there is that Mr. Gingold decided. He decided to be a certain way. He did not make the circumstances into who he was. He, you know, he made a decision to not let his past dictate his future. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that he erased it. He never erased it. All he did was he decided that he was going to move forward positively and that he was going to use those experiences as part of the humanity that he taught us, and how you could never do such a thing to a human being. How could you make a human being suffer like that? So Mr. Gingold found solace and he found peace in his violin playing and in music, and he shared that with us. And he was always very grateful for being in the United States. He had an enormous amount of gratitude, like many immigrants.
I was just thinking. I mean, that hits very close to home for me because you know, all four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and they, I must say, they had a very similar outlook to Mr. Gingold. That they, you know, they were very grateful for having, you know, wound up in the U.S. and for the freedom, you know, that they had, and really, I must say that of course they taught us well, but they all of my grandparents taught my sister and my cousins not to hate and not to be bitter, you know, not to hold grudges, and you know, they certainly, I think, would have had a reason to do so, but they also so yeah, what you're saying really resonates with me.
What a wonderful example it was to all of us. Which you know, we live in a world where, you know, there's always the word vengeance is somehow always applied in just about every political situation or every, you know, or geopolitical or societal, economic situation. And you know, Mr. Gingold just seemed to be above it all the time. And I think many of our ancestors, including myself, you know, I'm a first generation. I shouldn't say my children are first generation Americans. I was born in Cuba.
Of course.
And so, you know, we've all had our experiences with this. And Mr. Gingold actually helped me deal with that part of me too, very, very profoundly. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I was a pretty angry kid when I went to study with him. I was angry about a lot of things. You know, I felt like I was prejudiced against, and I felt people didn't give me credit because I was Cuban. And I even had one lady tell me, "Who ever heard of a Cuban violinist?" You know, and so, you know, those kind of, you know, those things when you're young, they kind of affect you. But you know, through Mr. Gingold's example, you know, he kept telling me not to be angry about things. Just to calm down. Don't be angry. Just focus your work on being good, and try to be a great musician, and try to be a person who is willing to share your talent and share the music with people, and try not to be angry. And it took me a few years, but I started to get it. You know, I started shedding all of that kind of baggage, and but he was the one who helped me do it. You know, so it had you know, all the things that he taught me were just not about violin. It was about so many other things.
And again, the same with Zvi, who you mentioned, and I should say that Zvi Zeitlin, one of his main influences was Mr. Gingold, and he taught at IU for one semester as a substitute for, I think it was Goulet, who was in the Beaux-Arts trio.
Daniel Goulet, yeah.
Goulet, excuse me for the mispronunciation, and shows you how great I am at French. And Mr. Zeitlin met Mr. Gingold, and they became very good friends, and Mr. Gingold became a mentor for him immediately. And Mr. Zeitlin used to say, don't develop a reputation as an angry, anxious Schwitzer. Schwitzer means literally sweater, someone who sweats in Yiddish, but I think it means just kind of someone who's just really worried about everything, and that was me a little bit back in the day. Not so much now. Maybe I don't care as much as I'm getting older, but he used to talk about that, about how just striving for quality, and that cream rises to the top, and if you always strive for quality and standard, it's going to happen.
Mr. Gingold used to tell me that violin playing was like being a great champion boxer. He said, you're going to get in the ring with the music. And he said, and the music will try to knock you down. The trick is to stay on your feet. He said, even if the music defeats you, but you stay on your feet and you finish the job and you get to the end and you keep your wits about you. And he said, you very rarely are going to beat the music, but it's important to stay with it and stay upright and take your knocks on it and keep moving forward. And I never really got that until I played the Schubert Fantasy. Then I figured out what he meant.
I was just thinking that I can think of certain chamber groups that I've been a part of where I wish it was a boxing match. No, but not my quartet, but you know what I mean. Anyway, could you talk a little bit about Isai's influence on Mr. Gingold? This is fantastic, and everyone needs to hear this from you.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, I myself, in every lesson that I give, I talk about Mr. Gingold, and in every lesson that Mr. Gingold gave me, he talked about Isai. And his time with Isai was incredible, and it was very fortuitous because he was able to play for Isai, and Isai took him immediately as a pupil, and there were many things that happened as a result. So, for instance, at his first lesson, Mr. Gingold was talking to him in English, and Isai said, "Monsieur Gingold." That's how he called him, Gingold. He said, "Monsieur Gingold." He said, "I'll speak to you in English for 2 weeks. After this, only in French." So Mr. Gingold immediately had to start taking French lessons. And he told me he found a French tutor for 25 cents an hour at the time, which actually, at that time of the century, is quite expensive. But his mother was with him for a while. She went with him. And there were so many amazing things surrounding it. When Isai, or when Mr. Gingold arrived in Paris to study with Isai, there was tremendous panic, and there's people screaming in the streets and paper boys running around with papers. He arrived the same day as the Spirit of St. Louis arrived. What's the guy's name? The famous pilot that flew across the Atlantic for the first time. I can't think of his name now. Anyway, but it was the first transatlantic flight ever, and so there was pandemonium that this happened, and so he went on to Belgium, and he played for Isai. There were, incredible stories about his lessons. One day he came in and he played Kreuz's Sonata, and Isai said, "Okay, let's go." And he sat down at the piano and played the piano part for him at his lesson. Well, Mr. Gingold discovered he was an incredible pianist. And then one day Mr. Gingold came in, and for his lesson, Isai was in his study, and he was playing scales, and he was doing a descending scale, and he was putting slides, down slides, and vibrating and making color and palettes, and Mr. Gingold listened, and he said, "Maître," which means master, "Maître, are you supposed to be vibrating, really, and sliding when you play your scales?" And I looked at him rather indignantly, and he said, "Monsieur Gingold, whatever you play in the violin, every note should have a tear in it."
Oh, wow. Wow.
And so for Isaïe, in Mr. Gingold's mind, Isaïe just couldn't let a note go by that wasn't expressive and beautiful and tender and thought out. And so he learned that from Isaïe. Just a scale had to be incredibly beautiful. As Elmar was saying about, Silverstein and Bronstein, how they played their scales with vibrato and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It shot me back to Mr. Gingold talking about Isaïe playing his scales with a lot of vibrato with downslides. Yeah.
And
so,
go ahead.
No, go.
I was going to say Isaïe's expression, much of it came through the bow, right? I think you and I have talked about that Isaïe was really the first among the greats to truly use the bow in a hyper expressive fashion. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, Isaïe revolutionized the bow. If you think about it, Tartini had written a treatise on the use of the bow and a thing called The Art of the Violin. And that was back in the 1750s. And then the bow, of course, morphed into the more contemporary bow that we now play, Bflat and all that kind of thing. And then nobody had really written an advanced treatise on how to use the contemporary bow. That came a little bit after Isaïe, from Lucien Capet, but after that. But Isaïe on his own basically revolutionized the way you play with the bow. There were a lot of reasons for that. First of all, Isaïe was about 6'4", was a very large man. He was well over 300 pounds. And, for him, playing at the tip was like playing in the middle for the rest of us. You see, so he had this kind of balance, and he had a certain leverage at the tip that people far smaller than him didn't have. So for him, playing in the tip was like us playing in the middle, which is our sweet spot in the violin. The bow in the middle is the sweet spot for us. So, or for him, his sweet spot was in the upper half. And so what happened? He started to think that all this pyrotechnical stuff that you do with the bow, like his teacher Vieuxtemps, a lot of flying spiccato, staccato, marcato, things like that, spiccato. He decided that, yeah, that's all fine and dandy, but there's so much expression that can be used in the right arm. And so, he started to develop different techniques of like shaping at the tip by using different angles and coming with the elbow a little further back, using a very broad, huge gestures with the right arm. You may have seen The Art of the Violin, the movie that came out a number of years ago.
Sure.
There's a short Isaïe playing in his older years, but you can tell these very grand gestures, almost Lisztian kind of approach to playing the violin. Very big gestures, huge pickups, and Mr. Gingold talked about how he just shaped every note with the bow. And so, of course, people like Chausson became enamored of that. And Isaïe was such a great proponent of this romantic French style, where it was like very opulent. And so Isaïe was one of the great violinists around that actually could play in that style. Sarasate was not that kind of player. Maybe the only other one that was similar was maybe Joachim at the time. But most of those violinists were still sort of offshoots of the Paganini area, where it was more about, pyrotechniques and playing fast and with all kinds of unusual bowing techniques and things like that. And Isaïe just revolutionized how we played with the bow. He became an opera singer on the violin, is really what he did.
Absolutely. One of my greatest memories of a lesson with Zeitlin, he had an incredible LP collection, incredible. And he took, now it's, of course, you can find it on YouTube, and I make all my students listen to it. The recording of Isaïe playing the Vieuxtemps Rondino, just, the poise, the rhythm, the clarity, the articulation, everything. You cannot imagine it a different way. It just was such a commanding, just a little piece, that written by his teacher. But gosh, there's just, it's inexplicable. How much greatness there is in that recording.
Yes, and for Isaïe, he didn't stay with Vieuxtemps that long, but Vieuxtemps had a profound effect on him, and there are many other stories about, of course, Mr. Gingold's experiences with Isaïe. sometimes, he was very taxing. He was very, very particular, and he would rag on Mr. Gingold quite a bit about his sound and about his fingerings being as absolutely as beautiful as possible. And he was a very exacting musician. And the other things that Mr. Gingold learned from Isai is that Isai really, in many ways, was the greatest musician of his time. He was a conductor. He was a conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony for a
Yeah,
couple of.
I learned that when I lived in Cincinnati that he was had been the music director there.
Yeah, and he was a wonderful pianist, which Mr. Gingold discovered. Of course, as a composer, he even wrote an opera. I mean, this man was a giant, and so you put that, and of course, he had the Isai Quartet. Debussy dedicated his quartet to Isai in the quartet, and so he was a monumental figure. And so Mr. Gingold told me the story about how monumental a figure he was. Pablo Casals had a party at his apartment in New York City, the turn of the century. Everybody that was anybody in the music business was there. Joseph Hoffman, Cortot, the pianist, of course, Casals, Chrysler was there, Isai was there. So they were all playing chamber music, taking turns and partying all day, So finally, it was Isai's turn, and he sat down to play with Casals and Cortot the E-flat piano trio of Schubert. And while they were playing, everybody was mesmerized. And Chrysler turned to one of the guests and he said, "You see, we're all children compared to him."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Gosh.
That's pretty that's an affirmation that very, very few people could have from his peers, the likes of Fritz Chrysler.
Chrysler. That's really. Could you talk about that's wow. Could you talk about the fact that I think it's understood that Mr. Gingold gave the premiere of the Ballad Sonata? Did he not? Yeah.
He did. He did. And at the time that the six sonatas were written in 1925, he had sketched them out in 3 days, and then in a week he had them pretty finished up, and then he monkeyed and toyed with them for a while after that until they were published. But by then, Isai was already in his late 60s and suffered from diabetes and other health issues. So he really wasn't in his tip-top shape anymore. And so when Mr. Gingold went over there in 1927, the Ballad had still not been performed in public, and Isai gave his blessing, and Mr. Gingold performed it not only in the class as a warm-up, but he also played it in a couple of recitals in Belgium. Mm-hmm. So he was the one who was entrusted with the premiere. One of the historical asterisks to this is that, oddly enough, even with me, trying to find this out for many years, I had no idea, and neither does anybody else, who premiered the other 5 sonatas. It's been almost impossible to find out who did them. And so probably what I would suspect at this point is that probably students from his class eventually were the ones that premiered the 6 sonatas. Of course, Mr. Gingold was the one who did the Ballad. So, but Quiroga was not playing very much at the time, so the 6th for Quiroga was out of the question. He was not going to be playing that in public.
Yeah.
And, the only other people that I could think of that could have premiered it is Yeti, who would have done the first, and certainly Thibault was possibly the third or the second. So it's just interesting because there's kind of a gap there, a historical gap that I wish I could fill because Mr. Gingold even didn't know who played the other ones.
We've talked so much about Mr. Gingold's humanity and kindness, and one of my best friends is Vivek Kamath. He's in the New York Philharmonic. He's a violist. We both studied with the same teacher growing up in Rochester with the late Lynn Blakesley. I don't know if you ever knew Lynn.
Sure.
Before I went to Tzvi, I was with Lynn, and Lynn was a wonderful, wonderful musician. And I guess that I didn't know this because I'm a little bit younger than Vivek, but Mr. Gingold gave a master class at Eastman I think it was like 90 or 91 or something, when Vivek was in high school. And he went, and he said he never forgot it. He said the first person that played, he didn't exactly remember everyone who played, but he remembered what they played. The first person played the Glazunov Concerto, one of the movements, and really played beautifully. And Mr. Gingold was so moved that he gave that person a hug afterward. He just went up on stage and gave him a hug before he started working with him. And then somebody else played Vietnam number 2, which is, most people play what, 4 or 5. And Vivek said he knew every note of every piece. Somebody else played, of course, Scottish Fantasy, but he said it just was incredible. And he picked up the violin, he demonstrated, and he said, I really had never seen anything. He was an older guy already then. And he said, never could imagine somebody just, effortlessly picking up the violin and playing it as though he just had performed it the night before. Amazing.
Yeah, Mr. Gingold, one time, this will take it even a little step farther here. Delana Jansen, the great young violinist at the time, she was getting ready for the Tchaikovsky competition, and she was in Mr. Gingold's class, and she was supposed to play in the master class that night. And she showed up, and she was extremely upset and apologetic, said that her pianist had caught the flu, was flat on his back, and couldn't come to the class that night to play. And so she was very upset about it. And she said, oh, Mr. Gingold, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry to tell you at the last minute. Mr. Gingold said, don't worry about it. Just play it. I'll accompany you. And so he played the entire accompaniment of the Sibelius Concerto while she played the solo part. He was playing all the trombone parts. He played the bass part. He played the cello part. He played the entire thing from memory.
Sure.
And he accompanied her.
Wow.
And, it was so impressive. And so I always remember something about Mr. Gingold. That is, a lot of people say, oh, I know that piece, or I've played that piece, or I performed that piece. You don't know anything unless you can do it like he can do it, which is he knew every part of the piece, not just the solo part. Mm-hmm. He knew every accompaniment. He knew every instrument that was playing. He knew what the balances were. He remembered every detail of everything he ever taught, every dynamic. He would just stop you. Of course, he never had the music in front of him. Never. I never had a lesson where he looked at the music, except maybe the Bartok Solo Sonata, right, because that wasn't a piece that was in his repertoire.
Sure.
But there was never another piece that he ever looked at that I can remember. And I played to honor him at the Tchaikovsky competition. You have to, at that time, you had to play a piece representative of the country that you were coming from. So since I identified myself as an American, I played the Roy Harris Fantasy because it was a piece that was dedicated to Mr. Gingold and written for him. And so, I was thinking of an American piece, and he suggested it. He said, do you know the Roy Harris Fantasy? No, I never heard of it. It was written for me. We can do that. I said, great. If it was written for you, even better. So I come to the first rehearsal or first lesson, and he stops after 2 bars. He says, no, piano. In the left hand, it should be E natural. No, no, take 2 bows slurred here, all from memory. Then he said, no, there's a cut here. You're supposed to cut from here to here. And he rewrote the piece. I said, well, Mr. Gingold, why isn't this in the music? He said, I got published. And he said, but then afterwards, I rewrote it with Roy Harris, and we never had a final version of it, but now I do. And so, this is 40 years, 50 years earlier. And so he still remembered every detail, every change in the left hand of the piano, every bit of the cut where you went, what the first note of the cut should be instead of the note that was written. He knew everything. In fact, I just pulled out the music the other day because I'm assigning it to one of my students. And I looked through it. I couldn't believe all the corrections, all the notes that I had written in there. And I knew Mr. Gingold remembered it from memory, every single detail of it.
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah. That's really knowing something.
I would say so. Gosh, that's incredible. I'm looking at my list, and I'm only at my 3rd question, but I think we're getting close to my video editor, wonderful video editor Carlos will really have a cow if we go too much longer. But I just wanted to get to a couple things. what kinds of technical exercises? I mean, did Mr. Gingold work with technique at all? I mean, did he work with Kreutzer, Rode, those kinds of things?
Mr. Gingold believed very deeply in all of that. We always had an annual Kreutzer class where we would go through all the Kreutzer etudes, and of course, he had modified them to, help us advance our playing, not just play it the way it was written. So, for instance, if you wanted to practice your staccato, we would have the staccato exercise, which is number 4 in Kreutzer, but then he never thought that was enough. So he would take number 2, da, 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 and he said, okay, what you need to do is practice it da, 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 up and down bow. And then he said, then at the very end, what you need to do is this. And he sat and he played the entire etude up bow staccato in one bow.
Oh my God.
Demonstrated it to the class. Like this, he just played the whole bloody thing in one bow. And we went crazy. We stood up, we were cheering, we couldn't believe it. It was amazing. And then he would just modify all the Kreutzer etudes and invent new techniques, which would make it much more up to date, because you can't really use the Kreutzer etudes for the Bartok concerto, So the whole idea was to create something out of the Kreutzer etudes to try to get closer to our contemporary repertoire. He loved Don't and Gavinier. He loved Fiorillo, actually.
Fiorillo, wow, okay.
He liked to play this one, I think it's the 7th, it's in D major. And he would often play it as an encore, he said, when he was a kid. Yeah, because it's really beautiful. It's beautiful and it's very effective.
Amazing.
And in scales, he was very keen on scales, although he didn't spend an awful lot of time with me on them. He just asked me once if I played scales, and of course, I don't know. There are lies, and then there's like lies the length of US 1, and I mean, I just said, yeah, I play. He said, well, I said sometimes, which was never, and then he said, well, you should, and that was the beginning of my own kind of journey to find out how to practice scales and what to do with them. And I would come in and ask him, a few things about it. And I had my own scale system that I developed, and he was very proud of that I came up with my own ideas and routines. So, he was a seed planter as much as he was a teacher, He always made you think for yourself. He often told me the most important goal of any teacher is to make themselves obsolete. Is to get you to where you need to go, and that you have all the tools that you need to continue on your own and do your own work. And so that's basically how he approached technique. He would plant a few seeds in you. You'd have to think about it. You have to come back with some ideas, and then he would modify them or give you some advice on them. But certainly, when my playing wasn't going well, we would resort to doing some technical work. Try to get myself back on track.
One of my most traumatic experiences as an undergrad. Again, I mean, it's just amazing for me to hear so much similarity with Mr. Zeitlin, with what you're saying. He made me my freshman year play Kreutzer number 8 because I had a problem with that stroke, right? Which I still to this day, I think I've done okay with it, but it's still something that I have a lot of respect for, that stroke. And he made me play Kreutzer number 8 in studio class, straight through like that. And other freshmen as well. And it was very helpful. Listen, to get up and do something like that is a milestone and a confidence builder for a student, I think.
Mr. Gingold took Kreutzer number 4. You know what he did? He made us play it on the G string, the entire etude.
Oh, wow.
And you know what? When you practiced it and you did that, Ravel Zigan, Sibelius Concerto, Bruch Concerto, everything that you play up on the G string, it was nothing. It was nothing because, you had to navigate all those half steps, and you have to get your hand all the way around the instrument. And so, and just an aside to this, an incredible thing that Mr. Gingold told me and taught me while I was doing that etude on the G string. I was complaining, I'm 18 years old, I'm an idiot. I'm saying stupid things because I'm 18, And I said, Mr. Gingold, I mean, why would anybody want to write pieces for the G string? I mean, this is impossible. And Mr. Gingold said, let me explain something. He said, yeah, Paganini wrote, like, for instance, the Moses variations on the G string. He said, do you think Paganini was stupid? You don't think that he thought of that too? He said, Paganini, he didn't really do that. He said he had a violin that he had doctored, that he put a bass bar under the A string, replaced the A string with a G string. And then when he played his G string pieces, he would take that violin out and play on the G string where the A string was.
Wow.
And he said, then, of course, it's very malleable and very possible to do it no trouble. He said, Paganini wasn't an idiot. He knew it was too hard to be doing this constantly. So he doctored a violin for his, virtuosic purposes. And that was an additional aside, to learning to play on the G string. See, these are the things that Mr. Gingold taught, that, it wasn't just play on the G string, learn to play up there, but rather historical, inventive, well thought out, genius type of things that Paganini did that, that I never knew. Most people don't know that.
No, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. There must be some modern technological advances that are, much easier now for students to get around that kind of thing. No.
Oh.
Andres, I know that you live next door to Mr. Gingold.
Yeah.
Tell us about that a little bit.
I'm a little bit ashamed, but okay. I'll say this. I was shameless. I admired and loved Mr. Gingold so much that to me, if I had 2 seconds with him, I knew I was going to learn something. I knew that I'd get a tidbit, a morsel, even a morsel. I was so hungry to learn from him. And so for about a year, I kept checking to see if there was an apartment that was available in his apartment complex so I could see him. And then what I was plotting is that he always took a taxi in the morning because he had glaucoma and couldn't drive. Mm. And his wife had passed away. So I kept thinking, if I'm there, I can pick him up. I could take him to school, save him money, and I can find out, like, maybe something about his eye or guitar or whatever. And so apartment came open in the same very building, one door down from him. There was like 2 entry doors. I was in the one on the right. I was in 907. He was in 903. And so we were basically 100 feet apart. And so my dream came true. Every morning I'd come out at the appropriate time when I knew he would be on his way to school. I'd come out, oh, Mr. Gingold, why don't I drive you to school? Don't take a cab. I'll be happy to drive you. Oh, okay. So I'd drive him. And then, of course, exactly what I thought. I would go there and he would tell me something about his eye or tell me something about what happened. I remember one trip, Mike, it was in the summertime. And I was taking him to the school because he was playing in the festival orchestra. He was playing concertmaster, and I was playing next to him. So we were going to rehearsal, and I picked him up. And he told me the story about one day he was on tour with the NBC Orchestra with Toscanini. Mm-hmm. This is a great talk that I got with him just because I drove him to school that day. And he said that Toscanini called a rehearsal on the 4th of July. And that they had already been on tour and they had already been rehearsing. And the orchestra was really annoyed. They were like, what? What do we need to rehearse for? We've already been playing all week and we already know the music. We've already been performing it. What is this all about? So they all came and they were angry. They were all in a bad mood. They came in. Toscanini walked up on the podium. He said, gentlemen, stand up. Stood up. He said, today is the 4th of July. And we're here in Italy. Let's play let's play the Star Spangled Banner, and let's remember, that we're Americans. And he said they played the bejesus out of it. And then Toscanini called the rehearsal. That was all he wanted to do.
Wow,
isn't that something?
That really is something.
Yeah,
that must have been some Star Spangled Banner.
It was
with those people, and of course, we're the quartet, the Primrose Quartet, legendary Primrose Quartet with Mr. Gingold and Oscar Shumsky and Primrose and Harvey Shapiro. Did he talk to you about that at all?
All the time. It, the repertoire that they played. Of course, it's a classic repertoire. It wasn't like this Hollywood quartet, which, they played more cutting edge pieces at that time, like the Prokofiev quartets and stuff. But Mr. Gingold's quartet, the Primrose, they play more classic stuff most of the time. But yeah, he loved it. It was, Mr. Gingold played second violin in that quartet.
I always wondered, did he alternate with Shumsky, or he played second?
Rarely, apparently, very rarely.
Okay.
But Shumsky played first violin most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they were all members of the NBC orchestra, so it was convenient. And in those days, they formed the quartet not just out of love for music and everything, but out of necessity, because in those days the orchestra season was like 22 weeks, 25 weeks at the most, and then the rest of the year you were unemployed. So many people, as you know, sold insurance or drove a cab or whatever when they weren't actually playing. And Mr. Gingold felt very blessed because he had the Primrose Quartet, when the orchestra wasn't in session. And then, of course, he started going to Meadowmount in the summer. Mm-hmm. And so he had a summer gig where he taught and coached chamber music also. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have to sell insurance, fortunately. His life was very immersed in music. And so he also saw the quartet as being a wonderful opportunity to do what he loved to do without having to resort to getting into another career, to support his family. So and
their recordings are just second to none, right? I mean, the Brahms Bflat and the Haydn Seven Last Words of Christ, and yeah, it's really amazing.
The Brahms Bflat, that's one of my most favorite quartets. And I remember the first time I heard it, I couldn't believe the sound that they get. It sounds like a symphony when they play it.
It's amazing, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Andres, I think we're going to have to leave it here, but we're going to do a part 2 about Mr. and maybe a 3 and 4, because there's just, I know, so much more that we can talk about. And before we quit, I just want everyone to know that I'm very privileged to be able to work with Andres with the Josef Gingold Chamber Music Festival of Miami. When you decided to start a festival, a chamber music festival, it was just inevitable that we were going to name it in honor of Mr. Gingold. So,
yeah. Well, Mike, it's a joy to have you as a friend, first and foremost. And secondly, it's particularly a joy because, I'm kind of a violin geek, and so are you. We're both people who revere and respect and honor our past teachers and all the things that they represented, not just in music, but in life. And, that's rare. I mean, there are a few of us who really connect with that and really understand it and appreciate it. And, hearing Elmar the other night when you interviewed him, it was the same thing, the kind of reverence that he spoke of about Bronstein and referring to, his past, coming from Russia and everything. And his time with Leopold Auer, who was arguably maybe the greatest teacher of all time.
Sure.
Certainly had the best resume of all time. And so, it's always a joy to play with you and talk with you.
Well, thank you so much, Andres. I appreciate it. And stay well, stay safe.
You.
And I think I'm seeing you later for a different meeting. So
right.
All the best. Yeah.
Our vaccines so we can get on with our lives.
Oh, God willing. Okay. All the best. Stay well. See you soon.
All right. Take care, Mike.
Yeah.